Hello, hello. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Ministro, buenos días. Buenos días a todos.
Buenos días. Good morning.
Good morning, good morning. We are about to start. So if anyone wants breakfast, desayuno, para los que quieran, por favor, siéntanse libres de pararse, servirse. So, okay, so just, are we on now, Maria? Are we, yeah, okay, thank you. Good morning to everyone here in the room and online. I'm Diego Zabaleta, I'm the Senior Policy Advisor of UNDP. Welcome to this session on From Measurement to Policy, Poverty Data to Guide Resilience Building Policy Design. So two quick announcements of logistics. People who are watching us on Zoom, there's translations, simultaneous translations. At the end, at the bottom of your screen, you will find a button that allows you to listen to this session on Spanish, English, Portuguese, and French, I believe. En la parte baja de su pantalla hay un botón en el cual pueden cambiar el idioma en el cual escuchan la transmisión al español, al inglés, al francés o al portugués. The second announcement is for anyone who just arrived. We have breakfast here, so please feel free to grab some coffee, pastries, and let's start the session because we have very short time. So this session, as the title says, is to discuss very specific policies, new policies, innovative policies that have been emerging in the last year for poverty reduction. And basically this session is coming from being worried about the pace of poverty reduction in the region. The region has had very good results in poverty reduction in the first decade and a half of the century, and by 2015, income poverty reduction started declining due to the different situations, both economic and political situations in the region. But before that, we managed to reduce poverty from 45% to 25% between 2000 and 2014. This remarkable reduction was due to basically economic growth and the use of specific tools, namely conditional cash transfers in the region. But we need to do more about this. Multidimensional poverty, in turn, also saw important reductions in the region, product of sectoral policies and more coordination between ministries. But this, as I said, changed in 2015. Growth slowed down and the region slipped into different crises. So in order to reestablish a robust trend on poverty reduction, we need innovative public policies because economic growth is not going to come back soon, and there's very limited space, so we have to become very efficient in public spending, and thus the need for new tools. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to our first guest, who is Sabina Al-Khair, who is the director of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, OPHI, of the University of Oxford, who will be talking about multidimensional poverty indices for effective poverty reduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Diego. It's so good to be here, and I'm grateful to those who have joined. I think we were all very moved by Minister Wellington Diaz's reminder to us yesterday of the lived reality of hunger and of poverty. And I think that stark reality that's lived and so far from our daily experience is really what draws us together to try to think of what is the most impactful way of fighting poverty. And while the PowerPoint is coming up, I will very hesitantly remember cricket, in which I am not an expert. But it seems that sometimes it can feel as if we're in a cricket game in which there's not one ball, but 6 balls. And how can you play cricket? And how can you bat? And how can you catch? And how can you run if there's so many balls in the air? multidimensional poverty is one way to try to consolidate the different initiatives we've been hearing about yesterday and today, and have one central focus, whether it's for targeting, for budgeting, for coordination, that we can use and that we can follow and that we can succeed in reducing and in changing lives. So in 7 minutes, briefly, let's go over that. Next slide, please. No. Is it possible to advance the slides? The clicker's not working. So the role of a poverty measure, on the one hand, is a statistic, but if you just leave it at a statistic, it has failed in its purpose. Its purpose is to motivate action. As Miguel Tsekeli in Mexico said, a number can awaken consciences, it can mobilize the reluctant, ignite action, generate, or even in the best of circumstances, end a pressing problem. And Tony Atkinson reminds us in his last book that, again, from an academic perspective, from a perspective of a person who worked all his life in Europe on poverty measurement, that the key thing is that measures motivate people in this development forum across different regions, that the measures become a tool in your hand, something that's exciting and meaningful, that captures what you are doing and can be a recognition for success. And so that poverty measures are seen as a performance indicator. So Juan Manuel Santos wrote a book, and if I had my dream come true, I would have given you each a book. It's translated and published in English and in Spanish. And I wanted to draw your attention to one fact that he said, was that in the case of Colombia, I personally took on the role of supervising social policy, and ultimately it made a difference. In the case of Colombia, the MPI, or multidimensional poverty measure, was a tool for policy. It wasn't a statistic only reported. It wasn't a number only used, but it was a tool for targeting, for budgeting, for coordinating policies, for motivating different levels of government and different sectoral ministries, and for management as a key performance indicator. It was updated annually. This was not the only priority Colombia had. Yesterday, you may have seen Juan Manuel Santos became chair of the elders. He was also negotiating a peace process during the time. But in those 8 years, poverty went down by 1/3, monetary and multidimensional. That's the kind of leadership, that's the kind of passion and follow through that we're yearning for. That a multidimensional poverty measure can take the many different activities that are being done in social development space and give them an added boost and an added visibility. Very briefly, I think many of us know, is that working? That to make a multidimensional measure, each country chooses the dimensions and indicators that both the protagonists of poverty, the poor men, women, and children, feel match their experience, and that policymakers and taxpayers feel are priorities. And then each person is identified as poor or as non-poor, depending on how many deprivations they have at the same time. And then the MPI captures all deprivations of all poor persons. It basically stacks them up. And what that means for you is that if any deprivation of any poor person goes down, multidimensional poverty goes down. It recognizes any success. But the other important thing is that a multidimensional measure looks at the different deprivations that strike the same person at the same time. So it can inform more efficient, cost-efficient, and effective integrated policies, because you can see the deprivations that walk together, count them, target them, and end them. I'd like to recognize that many countries in Latin America have a national MPI and have tracked its trends over time. And I put some of the trends there, recognizing the reductions in many countries over different times, and also recognizing the stability of statistical systems that report the MPI across different administrations and governments as a permanent statistic of poverty. At the moment, now 3 billion people live in countries that report an official MPI. So this is no longer a marginal phenomenon. Many of them are outside Latin America, but many are also within. And historically, the region has been pioneering. But now it's a time of change. Some countries are doing their second generation. Other countries, like Belize, have launched more recently. How are the countries using the MPI? One is to update, so the statistics can be a performance indicator. Ecuador, Colombia, El Salvador update every single year. Chile and Mexico every 2 years. A second is to institutionalize the MPI legally, so that it is there across governments and political parties, that it's there permanently embedded in the infrastructure as an autonomous marker of success. And then to use it in budget allocation formula, but also in social protection designs. We heard of so many non-monetary, non-cash, conditional cash transfer targeting programs, but the MPI can consolidate these. It can be used with data from social registries to target households, as well as poor groups, indigenous groups, afrodescendientes, children, elderly. And then it can be used, and this is perhaps its most popular use, to coordinate policies across different sectors, different ministries. And that was done very well known in the case of Colombia by a roundtable chaired by the president. But Ana Elena Chacón in Costa Rica chaired the social policy in that government. Others have been ministers who took leadership in their case. And we're blessed to have Michelle here, who also has been a leader and was the person who developed and launched the MPI in Panama. So I know my time is coming to an end. I have been really interested in all of the conversations we've had in this ministerial forum about topics like adaptive social protection, topics like social registries that we'll be coming to today, and all of the other activities of this group. And a multidimensional poverty measure cannot replace them. But what it can do is try to bring them together. So instead of somebody focusing on targeting, doing their own data, doing their own measure for focalización, instead of somebody doing health adaptive social policies, looking at people without access to health care, somebody else at children or people with disabilities, and somebody else looking at integrated policy design, that there can be a central instrument that holds the conversation. It's a nucleus. There will be additions in different areas, slightly different indicators in targeting, slightly deeper indicators when you blend health records data. But there can be a common, complex, multidimensional target that we're all pushing. And the multidimensional measure then can recognize success. And so we get a sense of accomplishment, and we get a sense of common purpose, not only in the ministries of social development, but with all of the other ministries that intersect with this work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sabina. Fantastic start with a discussion on how to use multidimensional poverty indices for policy action. I'm going to give the floor now to Roberto Angulo, who is the Social Integration Secretary of the Government of the City of Bogota. He's going to do a presentation online. So, Roberto, the floor is yours.
Hola, buenos días, Diego, Sabina, Michelle. Un saludo a todos los ministros, los invitados, a todos y a todas. Francisco. Bueno, muchas gracias por la invitación. Yo vengo a mostrarles una presentación sobre que he denominado microsimulaciones del IPM en Colombia.
I'm not hearing him clearly. There's too much of an echo in the room.
Lecciones aprendidas, todo lo que voy a contar aquí lo hemos hecho conjuntamente, o bien sea con OFI o con Inclusión SAS, con el PNUD. En este trabajo, que es un proyecto que ya sobrepasa nuestros cargos de turno, que venimos trabajando con Sabina y todo su equipo, creo que hace 15 años. Entonces, todo el conocimiento que y reúne muchas cosas que hemos conversado y hemos trabajado juntos, pero he querido como decantar una lección aprendida, y es cómo el IPM puede servir para
clearly what is being
caminos posibilistas en política social. Pero ¿cómo podemos explicar nosotros el posibilismo? Se me ocurre que una forma es mostrándoles esta cita de Doctor Strange. Este es un superhéroe de Marvel, las películas que están muy de moda ahora de cómics. Doctor Strange es un hechicero y ellos estaban luchando en contra de un villano que se llamaba Thanos, y en la penúltima película Doctor Strange visualiza 14 millones de mundos alternativos y encuentra que solo hay uno en el que pueden vencer a Thanos. El camino de vencer a Thanos era el menos probable. Si hubieran hecho una proyección de cuál era la suerte, seguramente hubieran perdido. Pero una vez Doctor Strange encuentra ese escenario en donde vencen a Thanos, todos empiezan a trabajar en función de que ese escenario ocurra. Lo que está haciendo Doctor Strange ahí, en la película, es buscar el camino posible, ¿sí? Buscar el escenario posibilista. Un teórico del desarrollo que trabajó esta idea, ya yendo a un tema más serio, fue Albert Hirschman, un teórico del desarrollo que decía que no podíamos quedarnos cruzados de brazos proyectando escenarios lúgubres, sino que si queríamos trabajar en el desarrollo, deberíamos trabajar por ensanchar los límites de aquello que consideramos posible. Busquemos el escenario posibilista y elevemos la probabilidad de que esto ocurra. Claramente, el método hirschmaniano o de Doctor Strange es un método que tiene sesgo a la acción. En política social y en América Latina y el Caribe, nosotros no tenemos otra alternativa que tener sesgo a la acción. Hay mucho trabajo por hacer, muchos compromisos por cumplir. Cuando uno combina el IPM con un ejercicio de microsimulaciones, creo que ya Sabina nos ha explicado muy bien y ha hecho un trabajo muy pedagógico sobre el IPM, pero cuando uno lo combina con un ejercicio que llamamos de microsimulación, que ahorita les voy a explicar en qué consiste, podemos buscar esos caminos posibles, hacerlos prácticos y articularlos, lograr la articulación que se requiere para conseguirlos. Una microsimulación puede ser entendida como la elaboración y análisis de escenarios alternativos al nuestro. Ese ejercicio de visualizar distintos escenarios alternativos. Es un ejercicio que se hace con encuestas y con modelos sobre las encuestas. Aplicada a la teoría del bienestar, es una herramienta que es útil para evaluar el efecto de diferentes políticas o programas en el bienestar de la población. Cuando yo pongo al servicio de la teoría del bienestar las microsimulaciones, lo que estoy haciendo es lo que autores como Amos Dillon o Tony Atkinson decían, evaluar el estado del mundo en términos de bienestar.
In terms of well-being, methods of micro-simulation, apart from strategies that involve multiple sectors, they include for poverty reduction.
all these that the Santos government has achieved. Have we had the opportunity to work there, and we created some possible scenarios with when we fail in one sector, we change. We emphasize on one factor. What does this mean? A possible scenario, a possible question for development. For example, what do we have to do to duplicate the reduction of poverty? Let's project the poverty in the time, and we see how the speed of reduction of this of poverty. The question has a scenario: what do we have to duplicate this reduction of poverty, multidimensional poverty? Another question: what are the strategies that will lead us to the reduction of multidimensional poverty? These micro simulations are a tool to construct possible scenarios to respond to possible questions related to the improvement of the social transformations. It has the following functional operator: to select a sample and to work with a survey. We set some routes to simulate the social policies and the criteria for focalization. We use microdata, and we construct scenarios of public policies. Those micro simulations are rules. In the case of poverty reduction policies, I simulate strategical programs on strategies, and there's an exercise of creativity of simulation of this. I would introduce this in a survey, and I start to do the analysis based on microdata, using some algorithms of responses to this strategy. We analyze economic characteristics and socio-demographic characteristics. Here we can understand, for example, some of the elements regarding the focalization and the strategies of the program, and we create scenarios of public policies, scenarios that can be reflected in the increasing of the benefits for persons, resolve this problems, or combine one thing with another. The simulations also fulfill certain statistical objective. It's like a crystal ball. How reasonable is the instrumental of helps with our strategies. This micro simulation gives us spaces for discussion. It should be results of discussions that would help to create policies. These micro simulations are a tool to translate the way of thinking and to take decisions of the policymakers to the language of the surveys. Always the exercise of translation. A well done simulation can have the policies which would again aimed at these exercises is for the creation of scenario that we can discuss and converse about. For example, here I have an example of a basic micro simulation. We have 4 people who have dimensions 1, 2, 3, and 4. Dimension 1 has a survey of 10 pesos, 5 pesos, etc. This is in this survey of the 4 people, the multidimensional poverty and the incidence of this multidimension, the percentage of the is 50%. another possible question, what are the possible strategies that would permit me to take 25% of reduction, reduce it to 25 pesos, and with them having an income of 15 pesos? I have two scenarios. I can combine a policy in dimensions 2 and 3, or I can have a scenario where the expenditure of 15 pesos with dimension in both scenarios is the micro simulations is in a political strategy on the survey. In the two scenarios, I decrease poverty by 20 to 25%. We, as political consultants of public policy, we have and we do reasonable exercises. We will select some of one of the two scenarios. What I want to say is that the micro simulation help us to understand the possibility of reducing it to 25, but MPI's micro simulations, and they have to go hand in hand in any exercise of public policies to real life. In the case of Colombia, we did micro simulations in the development plans of Santos Uno, and in this development plan of Ruti, and the president and the development plan currently, we did micro simulations for Bogota, and in this development. And I'm just going to go on to the final reflections. The micro simulations permit us to align actors who are responsible for the multidimensionality to the sectorial. It allows us to do follow-ups on the advancements and control. We can make decisions on investments. And finally, when I have the unit cost of each one of the social policies that affect the MPIs, the MPI would help us to make this investment decision, and also to adjust the decisions. But the main message that I want to leave to you is that when we make these indexes with the micro simulations, we are working with actions. We are introducing to ourselves in our way of thinking an action in Latin America. It helps us to have this. This is what we need in Latin America. Thank you very much. Wow. Thank you very much, Roberto. Very interesting following up on the discussion on the use of multidimensional properties and the indexes and how to conjugate them. We're going to have discussions further on sobre the monetary progress property. I'm going to pass the floor to Almorena Fernandez, who's going to speak on the
with complexity budget allocations for multidimensional poverty reduction. Almudena, thank you.
Thank you so much, Diego, and good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and thank you so much for your flexibility. I know we changed the time for this side event, so we're very happy to have this opportunity to discuss this issue. So what I'll present today is the result of a research that we very recently published with Kim Walsh here with me, that is here with me to present another research that she's working on, and with other colleagues, Luis Felipe Lopez Calva and Victor Stokowski, who are both working at the World Bank right now. And this is an idea that started when Kim, myself, and Luis Felipe were all working at UNDP And started as Sabina and Roberto were saying, with the MPI as the center, and us trying to think, how can we use this measure that has already captured the imagination of so many governments in the region, to push it a little bit farther, to really influence not only how we think about poverty, how we measure poverty, but also how we implement policy and programs on the ground, how we think about designing programs on the ground. So that was the idea behind this research, and right now it's a piece of research that we're hoping to continue to explore and eventually work on implementing on the ground. So this is a paper that we're calling Development Acupuncture, and it's really looking at the network structure of multidimensional poverty and its implications on policy implementation. So maybe Anish, you can help me out there. Next slide. So as I said, so this starts, in LAC region, we have 12 countries that have national multidimensional poverty measures that are an extremely useful tool for coordinating policy, and we see many governments using this tool for policy coordination, but we're trying to think, how do we use it farther for integrated policy solutions on the ground? How do we push this measure that is already there to have more integrated policy solutions? So to understand this, to have a better understanding of how to address multidimensional poverty, we know this requires a holistic and systemic-oriented approach that accounts for the complex and the dynamic nature of poverty, right? We know poverty, as the Multidimensional Poverty Index explores, is not only complex, but the nature of it is dynamic, right? As we move one indicator of poverty, everything else shifts. So how do we account for that when we're thinking about policy implications? And so in the economic literature, right, those complex systems are studied through economic complexity methods, and there's a lot of literature to that, but not as much of that economic complexity methods have been used for multidimensional poverty exploration. So that's what we were trying to do through this paper. Next slide, Anish, please. So in the paper, we proposed 2 new measures, and I'll explain them very briefly. One has to do, we try to interpret the poverty space, which is basically a visual representation that tries to map out the structural relationship between the various dimensions of poverty. So how the various dimensions of poverty interconnect to each other in the space of poverty. And this helps us see what are the different aspects of deprivations and how they're all interconnected. So this new measure we call the poverty space. And then within that poverty space, we try to determine poverty centrality. So within all these deprivations, we have this measure that assigns an importance score to each of these dimensions within the network. And the score reflects the prominence of each of the indicators within the network, and what are the potentials as strategic intervention points. So the paper explores these 2 new measures and how they play out in different countries. So using MPI data that OFI and UNDP collects for countries around the world, we apply this methodology. We look at these 2 new measures for 67 countries. And we map out the interconnected structures for 67 countries, and we use network science to look at the key nodes to see where these targeted interventions could have larger impacts. And what does this looks like? And here is just one example. And Anish, if you can click one more time because it's like a moving slides. This is just one example from Colombia, but we applied to 67 countries, and we also applied to different points in time to see how this network changed over time. And what we see is this is one representation of what this poverty space looked like. And as you can see, we have the poverty dimensions and how they're all interconnected. If you can go back, Anish, please. How they're all interconnected. And as you can see, for example, some dimensions, and I know it's very small on the slide, but just to get an example, some dimensions are very highly connected to many other dimensions, while other dimensions only have one connection, right? So we see some of them are more interconnected to others, and then the size of the circles that you see there is the poverty centrality, right? Some have more higher measure, more centrality are more have more weight to them than the others. So that's what we look like, and we look at over time. So very quickly, and I know time is short, so now we can go to the next slide. So let me tell you a little bit of the findings. So on average, and again, looking at countries across the world, the 67 countries, we find that cooking fuel is the most central poverty indicator, followed by sanitation and housing. Again, this is an average across the world, but interestingly enough, we find that it's these household characteristic indicators that tend to be the most central to the poverty dimensions across the world. We also find that child mortality, if you can go back, Anish, child mortality ranks as the least central indicator, always located in the periphery of the network. This doesn't mean it's not important, it just means it's not as connected to the other poverty indicators. And we also find, and I think this is quite interesting, that there's a high correlation across indicators, suggesting that the poverty structure within the countries remains quite stable across time. So we see that these structures don't change a lot over time, and that they remain quite stable. Next slide, Anish. So, you know, what are some of what these results are telling us? And as I was saying, this is initial research that we're really hoping to continue, and we're planning a complexity day, and we're planning more work, and this is a joint World Bank UNDP effort. But you know, we see the potential for really understanding what are these spillover effects for understanding the structure of poverty, and really how can we have use this information to maximize the impact of resource allocation and interventions when we're thinking about program implementation. And next slide, Anish. So just some final reflections, the importance about thinking holistically about policy. From a multidimensional measurement and from multidimensional coordination of poverty to really thinking about integrated policy, not only policy making, but integrating policy implementation. You know, by recognizing critical areas, policymakers can prioritize interventions that are likely to have substantial effects across multiple dimensions of poverty. Integrated and strategic policy frameworks can help us move away from isolated, siloed actions to more holistic actions, and this is some framework that can help us maximize impacts across a systemic poverty, a system of poverty indicators that how we can maximize impact over them. So that's all we wanted to share with you today. And as I said, I think we want to go deeper into this look at poverty from a complexity angle. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Almudena. This was a fantastic presentation. We have now heard about multidimensional poverty. In multidimensional poverty space, we have heard Sabina talking about the uses of the indices for coordination, for targeting, for monitoring. We have then jumped to Roberto talking about how to use micro simulations to enhance the use of these indices for policy design, set goals, linked it to the budget, for example. And we have now heard from Almudena new tools to help us think about which variables to choose to accelerate poverty reduction through complexity analysis. We are going to jump now to a different set of tools. We have here with us Kim Bolch from the World Bank. She's the economist and special assistant to the Global Director for Poverty and Equity. And she's going to be talking about real-time measurement of welfare for fine-tuning policies, responses to shocks. So a very specific use of data. So Kim, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Diego. Good morning, everyone. Buenos dias, bom dia. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to UNDP, to ECLAC, and the government of Barbados for inviting us to participate in this side event. It's an honor to be here on behalf of the World Bank's Poverty and Equity Global Practice to share with you a little bit about our new initiative on real-time monitoring of welfare, what we're calling RTM, and to discuss a few applications from the LAC region. And I want to say that this builds on a lot of work that has been done by colleagues around the World Bank. And this is a collection of many of those efforts and a sort of a strategic way to move forward on this research agenda. Can you help me to advance the slides, please? Thank you. So let me start a little bit by reflecting on the challenge that we're trying to solve with this approach. So as the people in this room know only too well, it's very hard to design effective policies if you don't have the information that you need. We heard yesterday morning from Prime Minister, the Honorable Mia Mottley, and Minister Humphrey in their opening remarks about the challenge of having real-time information in order to be able to allocate scarce resources to vulnerable populations when they need it. We know that we do not live in a static world. People's lives and their livelihoods are constantly changing. A family member falls ill, or someone loses a job, or they get a job. And this information is critical if we're going to adapt existing policies to ensure that they reach the right people with the right kind of support. Next slide, please. But also to inform new policy actions when the structural conditions change. For example, in the wake of a flood or in the wake of a hurricane. While this has always been important, I would argue that it's become increasingly urgent. Next slide, please. So we see that in our world today, we are facing increased levels of uncertainty. As this graph will show you, extreme weather events such as droughts and extreme temperatures and floods and storms are happening a lot more frequently than ever before. To borrow a quote from my boss, the future is not what it used to be. And this matters for people at the end of the day. Next slide, please. At the World Bank, we just developed a new indicator to try to measure the extent of this challenge. So these gray circles that you see here, there's a map behind it that's a bit washed out, but this is a global map, and you see the population represented with these gray circles. Next slide, please. And what we see here is in the blue circles is the exposure to extreme weather hazards, which alone is rather startling. So we see that more than half of the world's population, 60%, is exposed to extreme weather events. But what is even more worrisome is, next slide please, is these red circles. And what these red circles show are the share of the population that is both exposed to extreme weather events but vulnerable, which means that they would be unable to cope with that shock, whether that's because they are living in poverty, they don't have access to savings, they don't have access to services. And this is about a fifth of the global population. And I want to draw your attention to the difference between North America, where you see the blue circle is rather large. There's a large population exposed to risks, but the red circle is quite small. So most people would be able to cope with that shock. And if you contrast this to sub-Saharan Africa, the blue and the red circles are overlapping so much that you can barely see the blue circles, meaning that almost everybody who is exposed is vulnerable to these shocks. And we know that in the wake of climate-related hazards, there's often a bias toward the reconstruction of physical capital, of infrastructure, which is very important. But we can't forget that there's also large impacts on human development, on education, on food security, on income. And just because we can't see these as much doesn't mean that they're as important. And so we need timely information to be able to understand the extent of the devastation and to design policies to respond to them. So household surveys, which are what is often used for official estimates of poverty, are a foundational source of information. But even in the best of circumstances, they're only conducted every few years. If you look at the global state of data on poverty, you can see that less than half of the countries have a survey since 2020. And we know that the world today looks very different than it did in 2020. Next slide, please. So our program seeks to, click again, please. Thank you. Our program seeks to build on this foundational data, which I want to emphasize is necessary as a basis for this to work. So that's having modern statistical systems is absolutely critical. But we use a range of modeling approaches and alternative data sources to produce more timely estimates in between when this official survey data can be collected. And a lot of the early work on this was piloted during the pandemic, when many people realized that they needed more information to be able to respond. And it was very difficult to collect data during traditional ways. So a lot of experimentation happened, and the teams learned a lot from that phase of experimentation. Next slide, please. So most of these approaches require three ingredients, is how we talk about it. The first is this baseline data. So these are your traditional surveys with welfare information where poverty is observed, and these are absolutely critical. But then it combines it with what we call auxiliary data, which is sort of more high-frequency sources of data, whether that's another micro-survey, such as a labor force survey, or a high-frequency phone survey, macro data, such as GDP projections, or big data. I mean, the world today, we have satellite imagery, we have mobile phone data. There's a lot of information being produced every minute that we could be tapping into. And it typically uses some sort of model, whether microsimulation, which we heard Roberto talk about, or survey imputation, often augmented by machine learning methods to be able to transform these into timely welfare estimates. Next slide, please. So I'm going to be sharing a few brief examples about how this approach can be applied to answer different types of questions, and drawn a few examples from our work in the Latin America region. So microsimulation models, which we just talked about, often combine different sources of information, such as microdata, macro projections, and price data, fine-tuned to a specific context to be able to estimate how we think welfare is evolving in real time. Next slide, please. So you may have seen that a couple weeks ago, our Latin America team released the latest information on poverty in the Latin America region. But if we only had survey data, these estimates would only go up to 2022. Next slide, please. Building on their microsimulation model, we're able to predict how we think that poverty has evolved up until 2024, which is critical. So this kind of thing can help us think about, what is the situation today. Next slide, please. Another approach is collecting the information that we need in another survey that can be conducted more frequently. For example, we have an approach called SWIFT that uses machine learning to identify which variables are the ones that are most important for predicting poverty in a specific context. And then these questions to capture those variables, those covariates, can be embedded in different surveys that can be deployed more frequently. So for example, we can think about, there's these yellow squares that you can't quite see, but those is sort of a traditional survey where poverty is observed. And then the pink circles is sort of that set of covariates that you really need to be able to predict poverty in between. And those are the ones that you can kind of collect over time and more frequently. So next slide, please. So for example, this was deployed in cooperation with the government of Paraguay, with the National Statistical Office, to embed these questions in the quarterly labor force survey so that poverty can be predicted every quarter. And they have a running system where you have estimates every quarter. Next slide, please. And you see that it performs very, very well. So if we look at the fourth quarter of 2022, where you have both the actual survey, where this is observed, and the estimates, you see here in this graph on the right-hand side that the difference is within 1 percentage point. So these models are not perfect, but they work quite well. Next slide, please. So in addition to building on existing survey infrastructure, there's a lot of scope for leveraging more non-traditional sources of data, whether you're collecting new sources of data or tapping into existing sources of data like geospatial or digital trace or admin data such as tax data or social registries or barcode scanner data. There's a wealth of information out there that we can be using. Next slide, please. And one example I want to show is from Haiti. So in Haiti, the last household survey suitable for measuring welfare is from 2012, and the last census is from 2003. So this data is very outdated, and it's a challenge. It's hard to collect data in a context with social unrest and conflict, but that doesn't mean we don't need data. Next slide, please. So in innovation, the first phase of the innovation happened between 2021 and 2023. There were 4 waves of a high-frequency phone survey, reaching 1,500 households around the country and collecting information on livelihoods and assets and well-being. Like many Latin American countries, this was a high-frequency phone survey. Next slide, please. And right now, as we speak, this is a very, very new initiative that's being discussed in collaboration with the National Statistical Office of Haiti and with academics at UC Davis on how we can use mobile phone data. So not just the phone surveys, but combining that with the metadata. Every time you make a phone call, it'll ping a mobile antenna and you get information on locations and how long your phone call lasts and other kind of information that's being collected in huge volumes to be able to construct welfare estimates at a very local level, to be able to develop some kind of commune level map of welfare across the country in real time so that the government can help target poverty reducing policies. So this is a very exciting experiment. I don't think it's been done to date, and it's being funded by our global data facility at the World Bank. And I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to close here with this slide. And just a reflection on how can we think about this to inform policy. So this is an example I want to talk about from Bangladesh, where they were using these leading indicators. So not just tracking welfare in real time, but thinking about anticipating disasters that could have an impact on welfare. Next slide, please. So in Bangladesh, in 2020, the World Food Programme during the devastating monsoon floods, they piloted a new approach to delivering humanitarian aid in one part of the country. And what they did was they collected high-frequency data on floods, on rising water levels, which you get in real time. And they set up these anticipatory triggers so that once the floods reach a certain level, it releases cash before the floods ever arrive, which gives populations time to be able to buy food or water or whatever they need. And you can see here, if you click 3 times, please. You can see the distance between this first yellow square and this last yellow square, which is about a month. And that's the time between when the action was initiated in this case and when a traditional humanitarian response would have been released after the floods, almost a whole month. And our colleagues, current colleagues, they were formerly with the Center for Disaster Protection, published an impact evaluation of this program. And you see both short and long-term significant welfare impacts. The families who received the cash transfer were 36% more likely to go a day without, less likely to go a day without eating food during this. They used the cash transfers to buy food and water, and you see in the long term that they also have 3 months later that there was higher impacts on well-being and food consumption and easier to get loans and higher earning potentials. So I will close with that. If you can just click to the last slide, we have a QR code if you're interested in learning more. One more slide. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Kim. Just for everyone to know, we will put all the presentations together and also the links to the different papers we have been discussing here if you want to download them later on in the website. So with this, we are running out of time, but we still have one more presenter, who is Francisco Espinosa. He's one of the founding partners of Inclusión, a consulting firm in Colombia, but he's talking today on behalf of Juan Manuel Rojas, who is the president of Promigas, which is the largest distributor of gas in Colombia. So we are going to hear now a quick an exercise done by a private sector firm using these multidimensional poverty tools. So Francisco, you are online. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Diego. A special greeting to everyone and to the UNDP. And thank you for your very good presentations. As mentioned, I am presenting today on our consulting firm. Our natural gas is called Promigas in Colombia, which the participation of the main company. Quickly, I'm going to look at some elements of this. This company has presence in Colombia and Peru. It has 50 years of experience in our country and is in charge of the distribution of natural gas and for the production of electrical energy as well too. And I am going to also connect you to this what if okay, to start, I would also like to mention a few questions which were asked by a ex-minister of the country. He consulted with us because he had made a proposal because we had incentivized this country to design a multidimensional poverty program. He asked if these are not things exclusively for the government, and it's this type of for a company which work in this sector, and it's precisely the companies that have a projection beyond, as we say in Colombia, beyond the limits of company, what we call the production of poverty. This requires efforts from different fronts, and not only from the front of the government and for the sector, the public sector. There are those companies that have that capacity to look beyond the financial projections and against those who are embarking on this initiative in our country. It has generated other actors are beginning to be interested in the measuring of poverty, and this type of instrument is a public good for the decision making. A little bit to summarize where this idea came from. The multidimensional uses of measurements of poverty as a starting point for this measurement. The energy is used. How not this for some people who don't have energy, the food, if there's no electricity, the food cannot be preserved in their refrigerators, and then we can't do it because of the lack of energy. Our children cannot attend schools because there's no gas to carry out most basic of things. All of these. These all depend on energies for the daily lives. And likewise, an objective particularly the monetary measurements, and likewise, and this permits us to identify persons who have necessary appliances to transform that energy for the daily use. What is the proposal of this multidimensional measurements? And the multidimensional index is made up of these 4 dimensions. A dimension most basic and traditionally has been we have
tipo de combustible que utilizan los hogares para cocinar, algo que se destacaba igualmente en la presentación de Almudena como uno de los factores más característicos o que definen mayormente la pobreza. E igualmente la calidad en el suministro de esta energía eléctrica, es decir, si los hogares no enfrentan cortes o suspensiones en el suministro de la energía eléctrica y que estas suspensiones no sean demasiado prolongadas. Esta dimensión.
This dimension, as was mentioned, but these homes must have these. They require other facilities to be able to convert this energy in this different for daily use, to be able to save and to facilitate. That's why the second dimension is first.
Also, the location of the home in some cases. In other cases, there is some solution to be able to identify a little the height or the climate of where the home is located. You can tell if they have a gas stove or Francisco, 1 minute please. Where you can, if the home has internet or computer or television, and gives a little bit more context. If the home has electric service or young children, and if the neighborhood has an office for childcare, considering the population of our country that is in this situation. If we compare the urban zones with the rural ones, in the rural zones it is 3 times worse than in the urban ones. The presence of multidimensional poverty is very concentrated, and we find instances where others up to 75% in these areas that are around in the border of our country. And so in this, imagine we see the municipal data, and we see large contrasts in the indices of poverty of 0.5%. Simply to close, I would like to highlight where are the main challenges for our country to alleviate poverty. A very important challenge. It continues to be a challenge for our country in all of the homes, the solutions in time through these devices. Equally, there are material challenges that are very relevant to be able to transform the knowledge and education. And I think that there we can end. Thank you, Francisco, and sorry for rushing you. Michelle would like to say something, or do we close here to pass? Yes, in 1 minute, I would like to say to the others who have spoken, to make it clear, the potential and capacity that you have to measure and to direct action according to the priorities of each country, which are different. But I'd also like to highlight that we are talking about measuring the policy. And
it is also political. How can we connect these three levels? This is key. The decision making, Savina, as you mentioned, the example of the experience which Colombia was able to advance. Not only with its technical solidity, available data, a robust tool, but a president who led this together with this. A couple of days ago, there was a course of training for executive for ministers and decision makers. The Ministry of Peru, who was there together with the Vice Minister, and other authorities were there. With that, we had an analysis, not so technical, but the minimum of us technical aspects that those of you who should make decisions and to be able to direct their technical team, and but they can determine what are the priorities, and you all as ministers they also have the need to communicate and to connect with the at the highest level of those decision makers, the president, the vice president of the republic, making a political and a technical case for the reduction of poverty. And in this course, we try to cover various dimensions. What was mentioned today, the focalization, the use of planning, and how can we communicate, how we can present a topic such as so sensitive as poverty, and the publish the results of poverty, if it improved or not. There are always political consequences in this communication, and that course, which was presented, it was global, and they for decision makers in different parts of the world. And together we are talking with CASCA also for next year to have a training course for executive exclusively for Latin America and the Caribbean, based in the particularities of the regions and the levels of advancement that the region has in terms of measurement, prioritization of objectives, and matters related to reduction of poverty. But we don't have time to do that. But I think this idea of having you together is fabulous to listen to what would be relevant for you that we include in this. What are the topics that for you today in the decisions, the position that you will find will be useful to be able to cover, to understand better, to analyze better what types of cases would be useful for you to understand and to be able to take to your countries where you find the difficulties in this narrative towards the public and the citizenry, and also to the monetization and the articulation of those articles. Of those actors who the multidimensional and also to understand your availability and interest in terms of time. If it's something would be useful for you based on your tight schedule, if you want it in a virtual format, if you want something in person, or if you can think of different layers, perhaps a session, intensive session in one day with you as ministers, but after that you can designate person to deal with the technical and political part, so we can go deepen in this. And this is something that we can accommodate. So to conclude, we want to design something that is flexible, for the decision that can be taken today. And later on in the day, we will approach you so that you can give us your feedback and what would be useful for you. And also together with OFI, to work out, to plan a summer course that is purely technical for those technical teams of your ministries. An option is to be able to do those two courses and have the political and technical dimensions. I reiterate, for us it would be useful to have that documentation and we put at your disposal that could for something that would be useful for the challenges that you find. Thank you very much, Diego, and I pass the floor to you. Thank you very much. Without any further ado, thank you very much to all the participants, and we invite you to the following session. Thank you very much.